Hello and welcome to this Edexcel GCSE Geography exam skills, looking at command words and key terms, and this is part 4 of the series, looking at detail at the level marked answers and in particular assess and evaluate. We'll be looking at what the command word means and the mark schemes, and for this one we're going to be looking at those you'll find in paper 1. Part 5 will include the type of questions you might find in paper 2 for the human element of geography. So just a quick recap, having a look at all the different command words that we've looked at. So these are the simpler command words. We did a series on examine command words that turns up in the rivers and coast section, and now we're going to focus on the assess and evaluate command words. And if you've seen the other videos in the series, you'll know this from the exam board, and it tells you how many marks each of the different command words could be given in the exams. And you'll see for assess and evaluate, they are both worth 8 marks. But do remember that some of the questions will be worth another 4 marks for your spelling, punctuation and grammar. So, just to recap on the type of questions that you'll find within the exam, the basic knowledge questions that you can see there account for about 30% of the total answers. This is because there isn't a higher or foundation paper, it's all differentiated throughout the paper. So if you can manage to get all of these correct, you'll be aiming towards a level 3 or thereabouts. We then have the understanding questions, the explain and suggest, and these total around 35% of the marks. So getting these correct along with these as well is moving you to the grades 5 and 6. The questions that we're looking at now, the assess and evaluate, are worth another third of the marks, and this is going to be pushing you towards the grades 7 to 9s if you do well in those. It's also important to remember that there are maths-based questions with these kind of command words worth about 10% of the marks, which could come into any of these here. And the geographical map skills, again, another 10% of the marks, and these will generally work into the knowledge or understanding questions. It's also important to remember that 40% of the questions will be based on resources. So you've got to get used to reading the resources and looking at how you could use those to answer your question. So if we have a look at assess and evaluate questions, they are found in the weather and climate and ecosystems in paper 1, that's what we're looking at today. And they'll also be found in changing cities, global development and energy. But as I've said before, they're always worth 8 marks, but for the ecosystems and energy resources, there are 4 extra marks available for your spelling, punctuation and grammar. So use your punctuation correctly. Remember capital letters for proper nouns such as place names. Use a good structure using clear paragraphs. I always suggest leaving 2 lines clear between each paragraph. This makes your paragraphs clear, but also if you want to go back and add information, it gives you space to do that without drawing stupid arrows and stars and things like that. And also get used to using those geographical key terms because they are important. So if we have a look at the mark scheme, these answers for the 8 markers are not point marked. You don't get a mark for each tick that you see. They are level marked. So level 1, the basic, is where you've got some correct information. You're kind of seeing you've got some of the keywords in there, but it's not necessarily showing that greater level of understanding. There's some misconceptions or misunderstandings in there, and you've only looked at one side of it and there's no evidence in there. Level 2 is where you're starting to show that you are understanding the question, you've got some of the key information in there, you've started to explain it, but it's not necessarily coherent or it doesn't follow naturally. For level 3, well, let's have a look at level 3 in a bit more detail. So what we can see here is level 3. Now what I've done is try and put these boxes around it to show you what each of these bits means. So it demonstrates accurate understanding of the concepts and the interrelationship of places, environments and processes. So what does that mean? It means you've selected the correct information to answer the question, you've given the correct keywords, locations and processes which are relevant to the question. For applies understanding, you're showing that you link the information to answer the question. You're not just writing anything about anything. A balanced and well-developed argument. So basically, you've used that information, you've used your literacy skills, and you've made a key judgment based on that, on the question and the information you've selected. And finally, that you've backed up your answer using knowledge and understanding of the correct case studies. Another way to look at it is maybe in a Marc scheme like this. So here we've broken down all the different elements that you need to include, from a brief introduction showing you've understood the question and got the key terms in there. You've got your knowledge or your points which are relevant and use key terms. We've got your explanations which are clear and relevant to the question, and extended using connectives, which means that, therefore, this leads to, so, which. And you've got evidence in there related to the focus and restriction of the question. Is it a developing country, or is it an emerging country, or is it a developed country? Have you made judgments? Yeah, and we'll go through that in more detail. And then particularly for evaluate, have you got a conclusion? You also need to make sure that you've got a clear structure with paragraphs and it's well linked, and literacy, particularly where those extra 4 marks are available. So looking at the question, the assess questions in this specification, it says, assess questions are there to use evidence to determine the relative significance of something and give balanced consideration to all factors. So basically, use relevant information from case studies to show an understanding of the key factors which cause something to happen, and then clearly state and explain why they are relevant. Now, you don't need to give all factors everywhere. You're looking at giving 3 or 4 key points or 2 points which are well contrasted, and that will be enough. When we look at evaluate questions, they're very similar but also different in a way, in that here you're looking to measure and value the success of something. How important certain factors, or how successful have these actions been? Again, you need to look at evidence, but using strengths, weaknesses, or alternatives. And you must have a conclusion for evaluate questions. That is so important. Now, what you can do is have a simple structure for each of them. And you will notice that the structures for both are very similar. Now, the best answers don't necessarily have a set structure like this, but this is a good starting point. So you can pause it here and have a look. But it really looks at an introduction, just rewording the question and giving the key terms. And then for each paragraph, you make an explicit judgment relevant to the command word. You then give your evidence and explanation, and then maybe a point, a counterpoint to say, however, but on the other hand, because this is what we call an implicit judgment. And then a little summary at the end, a little sentence at the end just to summarize it. Repeat it for another paragraph. For assess, just a very brief conclusion is always a good idea, but you don't necessarily need one if you've made these judgments throughout. But for an evaluate, you do need a much more detailed conclusion. To help you with the structure, you could use a writing frame similar to this. Now, this doesn't always fit, but it does give you a good example of the kind of connectives and starters that you can use. So pause this and have a look and maybe make a copy of it. So moving on to some of the questions. Here we can see some of the different questions we get. And one thing that we always focus on is how you break down the question. So if you were to have a look at these, what would you say the command words are? What is the topic that you've got to talk about? What's the focus? And what is the restriction? So pause it now, and could you have a look and see which one of these you think they are? So how did you do? Now, some of these are pretty interchangeable, but you can see the command word. It's not just one word. So it may be something like assess the following statement, assess how effective, evaluate different responses. We then look at the topic. Here we can see we're talking about drought. Here we're talking about tropical cyclones. Maybe a tropical rainforest, or tropical rainforests and deciduous forests. So you've got to understand what it wants you to talk about. Then you've got the focus within that topic. So here it's a greater threat to people. You've got to talk about the threats to people. Here it is, the responses to a tropical cyclone. Here you're talking about environmental impacts. So you can see that the question gives you a clue to the more specific information you've got to talk about. And finally, there is the restriction. So these is looking at developing countries and developed countries. You've got to compare them. The same for this one. Whereas here, you're looking just at a named developed country. So maybe USA, Hurricane Sandy and Katrina. Here we're talking about a named area of tropical rainforest. So it's really important that you do see the restriction. Now, when you're revising, what you can also do is think about, well, okay, how could we change the topic? How could we change the focus? How could we change the restriction? Because you're not going to see these questions exactly like this in the exam. So think about, instead of drought, what could you use? Instead of a greater threat to people, what else could you do? Obviously, if it's talking about a developed country, it could be swapped for developing country. So just pause it now and think about, for the topics, how could you change the topics? What other topics could you have within that question? Think about how you could change the focus and have a go at that. So pause it now and see what you think. So here's some ideas. So instead of saying tropical drought, you could say tropical cyclones. It could be presents a greater threat to people, or it could be a greater threat to the economy or to the environment. So by doing this, you can start to understand the whole range of possible questions that might come up in the exam. And it just helps you prepare if you are flexible. If you are able to think about, well, okay, looking at the specification, I could change this and I could change that. Okay, so that's a very useful task. Now, another useful task is to compare two questions. So here we have, assess how effective responses to tropical cyclones are in developed and developing countries, and evaluate different responses to the environmental impacts of tropical cyclones in a named developed country. So what I'd like you to do is read through both of those and just see what are the similarities, what are the differences. So have a pause, have a go. Well, here you can see then, both of these are talking about responses to tropical cyclones, and they need to use case study information. And because you're talking about responses, you want to consider individual, organisational and governmental responses to these. However, the differences, one is assess, one is evaluate. So the evaluate one must have a conclusion. One is comparing developed to developing, whereas another is just evaluating those in a developed country, just USA, rather than Philippines. And one could be any response, social, economic or environmental, whereas two focuses purely on the environmental. So you can see that although they're quite similar, they're also very different. And this is why it's so important to look at the different questions. Okay, so I hope you found that useful. Please feel free to replay this video to help improve your understanding and send me an email if you're not sure of anything. But hopefully you found it useful. Thanks very much for watching. Please do watch the other videos in the series to help improve your understanding of the questions, and hopefully see you again soon. Many thanks. Bye.